Thanks be to God. Steve Fry's family will tell you, and they tell me, that if you happen to be sitting next to him on a Sunday morning, at some point during the worship service, he will nudge you with his elbow. The gentle jab is a sign that he has just heard some reference to a bird during the service, in a song, a sermon, or a prayer, or in the sounds just outside the sanctuary. His nudge is an invitation for you to join him in noticing this rush of delight darting by. Apparently, there isn't a bird, a whistle, a wing, a feather, or a flight that escapes his attention. There is also never a worship service that doesn't include something about a bird at some point during the hour, I'm told. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised. Birds, after all, are everywhere in the Bible. In the story of creation, God hovers over the face of the waters, like a bird, the ancient storytellers suggest. Pigeons, birds of sacrifice, are the currency of mercy in the temple. Ravens bring bread to hungry prophets in their beaks. Quail show up in the wilderness to feed the Hebrew people after they are freed from captivity. God is like an eagle, the text says, carrying the Israelites on her wide expanse of wings. And in the Psalms, it's under those wings where the troubled take refuge and find shelter. A dove alights on Jesus when God names him beloved at his baptism. And Jesus compares himself to a mother hen when he weeps over the city of Jerusalem. Jesus also urges us, especially when we are anxious over many things, to consider the birds. Consider the birds. Yesterday, 11 of us ventured out to do exactly that. We met at the White Rocks trailhead at 6:30 to greet the dawn chorus. Early in the morning is the time when their beautiful racket is at its peak. So with our binoculars in hand, we gathered together to walk and wait for small gifts to appear on bare branches in the cottonwood trees and for wings to take off into the sky. By the time we headed back from our walk, we had seen or heard 47 species. Steve counts them for us. Among them, we saw northern flickers, orchard orioles, house wren, eastern kingbirds, great blue herons, double-crested cormorant, an American goldfinch, a dozen killdeer, and a snowy egret with big yellow feet. Steve was our guide. Years of bird watching, not only in worship, but also in the wild, and in the Fry's bird-friendly backyard, have finely tuned his attention. He is usually the first to hear or recognize a bird by its song, and the first to catch a glimpse of it. And if the bird happens to linger for more than a few seconds, he or Julie can tell you where to turn your head or lift your gaze to find it too. Stories have been told about these amazing powers of observation.
Birds have been a part of my life ever since I can remember. My mom says it started when I was a baby. She was a mother of 3 boys, all under the age of 3, in a 2-bedroom apartment which was attached directly to the hospital and the medical school where my dad spent all of his time. So her only solution for this, so she didn't go crazy, was to take us all to the park. and she would watch over my other two brothers while they ran around, and I was just flat out in this little pram that they had, looking straight up at the sky. And so she thinks that's why I became a bird watcher, because I was just always like that. And growing up, my folks had all kinds of woods out in back of the house, and I was just always out there playing around. I had all kinds of interests in natural history. Sometimes I would go through a mammal phase or a reptile phase, astronomy, chemistry, just all kinds of things, but I always came back around to the birds. When Julie and I were married, we structured our whole wedding ceremony around the natural history of sandhill cranes. And we kind of deconstructed the wedding ceremony and put it back together along with all kinds of natural history about sandhill cranes. We started out as colts, as they're called, little baby sandhill cranes being raised by our parents, and then being part of a larger community of family, and then being part of the big world in the wintertime when the sandhill cranes all gather together. And then we ended up with spring as our individual journey was taking off. It was all around sandhill cranes. So at our rehearsal dinner, some friends did a little skit. And this skit was them just having a normal conversation, just talking. And then every once in a while, one would just stop and yell out a bird name. They'd say, "Yellow-breasted chat." And then they would go back to their normal conversation. Then the other one would say, "Barn swallow." And on it went, it was okay, that was very funny. I get it, we interrupt people when there's birds around. So then after the rehearsal dinner, we were out in the parking lot all talking, and all of a sudden a great horned owl flew right over us, and Julie and I both simultaneously pointed and yelled up, "Great horned owl!"
That's great. Here's what Steve and Julie know. Once you start looking for birds, you see them everywhere. Every tree, every branch, every feeder, every flash in the sky. Blue jays and starlings and red-winged blackbirds rise and descend. They dart in and out of our awareness. It makes me wonder if it might be the same way with the grace of God. That once you start paying attention, you discover God's loving touch in places you hadn't thought to look before. In the places you haven't turned your head or lifted your gaze to notice in a while. Or in whatever flits by on any given day. Some may choose to believe that the world is flat and dull. Maybe that's because we sometimes feel overwhelmed with despair at the world's condition. But then there's the whir of a colorful hummingbird at the feeder on the porch, or a whole flock of geese takes off from the water all at once to spread out in a giant V across the expanse. And then you remember what God surely wants you to know. That the universe is ardent and vivid and moving. There is always more going on than meets the eye and ear. The Spirit is always stirring. And this long stretch of predictability we call daily life, it's really a wondrous game of hide and seek with the divine. Birds also remind us that the things that can make a difference to us, that lift our hearts or give us joy or inspire us with hope, don't have to be big. They can be very small, little sprites with wings. A spirit that's carried on the wind, even as ordinary as a sparrow.
So later in the service, Rebecca is going to lead us in a unique version of God's eye is on the sparrow. And I'm here to tell you that God is not the only one whose eye is on the sparrow, because mine are always too. But many people dismiss sparrows, and I suppose that's why they're the subject of the hymn. Sparrows can be difficult to identify. They're brownish and they're small and they like to hide, but they're not hidden from God's eye or mine. And some birders call them LBJs, little brown jobs. Especially when they go hiding and they can't identify it, they're like, oh, that was an LBJ. But if you really take a close look at the sparrows, they just have all kinds of textures and patterns. They're beautiful earth-toned birds, but they do like to hide. Let's see, I lost track. So they also have beautiful songs. And one of the sparrows that we have here in Boulder County is called a vesper sparrow. And vesper sparrows sing when all the other birds have gone quiet at night. So if you go out to the grasslands tonight, right when it's getting all calm, you'll still hear the beautiful sound of a vesper sparrow calling out. Be your own vesper service. And other sparrows, like the lark sparrow that's shown right now, has all the feather topography possible, has every facial marking you can imagine. They're just a real showstopper of a bird. But if you look at it from far away, like if you put your field guide about 10 feet away and look at it, it becomes just an LBJ, a little brown job. When I go into classrooms and, talk to the first graders or whatnot, they always want to know what my favorite bird is. And that's a really difficult question for me to answer. And Julie will tell you that I like to separate the birds into many, many different categories so that I can have a lot of favorites. I'm like, well, are we talking about there's small falcon or a large falcon or a diving duck or a dabbling duck? And I split them all up so that way I can have more favorites. But for me, there's one bird that stands out in my life, and that's a black-capped chickadee. And when I make that pronouncement in the first grade class, all the first grade boys look very crestfallen when this large guy says that he likes a black-capped chickadee. They all want it to be something more majestic and powerful, a golden eagle or a peregrine falcon, But I tell them it's a black-capped chickadee. And black-capped chickadees are special to me because when I'm out in the woods when I was a kid and even as an adult, they're just kind of all around and they seem to almost follow me and entertain me always. But chickadees are a very fascinating little bird. First of all, they say their own name, chickadee. If you've ever heard that song, they say their own name. And the number of D's that they add at the end of their song is an indication of what kind of threat is out there. So they communicate to other chickadees what the possible threats are by the number of D's that they use. So if they say chickadee-dee-dee, that might mean a snake. Or if they say another number of them, it'll mean a hawk. So they communicate with each other by the number of D's that they put on, which I think is fascinating. And they just found this out not too recently ago. Where I grew up in Minnesota, a lot of the birds leave because it's cold, right? But chickadees stay year-round. and they basically shiver all winter long to try and stay warm. So on a really, really cold night, like 20 below, a chickadee can lose up to 30% of its body weight just from shivering. So you can tell it's imperative the next day that they fuel up. Right? So one of the mechanisms that have evolved in chickadees is that every fall they grow new brain cells, which is really quite a wonderful thing because you and I cannot do that. We have been on the brain cell slide ever since we were kids. But chickadees grow new brain cells so they can remember where they've cached food for the wintertime, so that they can go to those places and fuel up before the next cold night. So these are just a few of the things that really endear chickadees to me. But I just love, they're just clownish and funny, they're good company, and they're sturdy little bird. And they keep good company.
So there are small birds, and there are big ones. I remember the first time I saw a pair of eagles close up in real life. It was only a few years ago. They'd made their nest in the upper branches of a tree next to Lake McIntosh in Longmont. And I noticed that on morning walks around the lake, people invariably would pause to look for the massive raptors, to admire them. Bald eagles are so magnificent and so powerful, we might forget it wasn't that long ago that this emblem of our national strength was once an endangered species. Some 60 years ago, with the widespread use of DDT, eagles were becoming terribly weakened. As the pesticide interfered with the bird's ability to process calcium, eagles started to lay eggs that were catastrophically fragile, with shells so thin they broke when the parents sat on them to keep them warm. Our national bird was becoming extinct. In the days of George Washington and Ben Franklin, there were hundreds and thousands of bald eagles in North America. And fewer than 200 years later, there were only 417 nesting pairs in the United States. Then in 1962, the New Yorker began to publish segments of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. For the first time, people across the country began to realize how petrochemicals were decimating the bald eagle and other bird populations. Carson wrote, "Over increasingly large areas of the United States, spring now comes unheralded by the return of birds. And the early mornings, once filled with the beauty of birdsong, are strangely silent." In the Aeneid, the pathway to hell is Averno. Translated from the Greek, it means a place without birds. Carson's research and writing described such a place, and it made people pay attention. Recently, I read that the public concern created by all the dying birds was in many ways the beginning of the environmental movement in our country. The Environmental Defense Fund was formed in reaction to the DDT problem. Scientists, ornithologists, toxicologists, insect control specialists, and ordinary citizens everywhere came together to help save the birds. In 1967, the eagle was declared protected. In 1972, DDT was banned. The National Wildlife Refuge Network began to provide habitats for nesting pairs of eagles. A variety of centers throughout the country began to breed eagles in captivity and released them into the wild. Through the work of bird lovers and the support of environmental laws, the population of bald eagles in the lower 48 states had doubled by 1981. In 1993, there were 4,500 nesting pairs. In 2007, the bald eagle was removed from the endangered species list. These days, eagles are everywhere. In 2020, it was estimated that there are now more than 71,000 nesting pairs in the lower 48. Last week, Pam Archer sent me this photo from her neighborhood next door newsfeed. After several years of mishap and heartbreak, 3 eaglets were born this spring at Stanley Lake. Someone once suggested that perhaps we might now think of the eagle as an important symbol for our nation, not because of its impressive wingspan or its fierce strength, but because it serves as a reminder of what we can do when we pull together. It reminds us of the power we have to bring something treasured back from the brink of extinction. Surely that's a message that resonates with our souls these days. It is possible to change our ways in order to protect what's vulnerable. The birds, our democracy, the climate, our planet. It is possible for us to cooperate with one another when the common good is at stake. We know this is true because we have done it before. We have nurtured what was fragile and vulnerable to bring something beautiful back to life. And the eagle is an emblem of our enduring hope. In our scripture reading for today, Job reaches out to assert that even in the midst of difficulty and distress, we can still see and be embraced by the goodness of God. If you're not sure that you can find it on your own, Job says, consult the animals and the plants. They will teach you. Look at the birds. Consider the birds. They will always teach you. They are reliable witnesses and revelations of the goodness of God. Amen.